Wonderful, really beautiful start to the morning. Thank you. And thank you, Linda, for inviting me to be here. And thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to be here. I wish I could be with you in person as was originally planned, but nonetheless, it's lovely to be here together online. It's a real pleasure to be sharing my thoughts and learning from all of you here today. I'll just very briefly introduce myself because we don't know each other. So I'm Tim, I'm a Christian. I go to an independent church in Exeter called Belmont Chapel, but I'm not a theologian. I'm a marine biologist. So I do research at the University of Exeter. At the moment, I'm studying marine bioacoustics, which is looking at how and why animals underwater make sound, how they use that in their underwater life. I focus particularly on coral reefs, and I'm trying to understand more about how we can understand coral reef ecosystems better in such a way that we might be aided in protecting them. So my job means that I spend a lot of time thinking about the oceans. And that's because through my work, I spend more time studying the sea than I do doing anything else. Often that takes me to the most remote corners of the world for extended periods of time. And frankly, there isn't a lot to do in those places apart from look at the ocean. So there's a fair amount of space to think. So for instance, this island at the top of your screen is a remote little island 30 miles off the coast of Australia. And this island was home for me for 3 months every year for the last 4 years. There's a research station on the coast of the island there, and it was our base as we ran experiments and asked questions about the impact of climate change on the coral reefs surrounding the island. And this boat on the left of your screen was my home for 2 months. I joined a team that sailed a 2,000-mile transect across the Arctic Ocean, taking measurements of the water chemistry and samples of these zooplankton up in the top right of your screen to try and understand how they were changing as latitude changed. I was also taking sound recordings, that's this picture here, to listen out for the whales under the ice and work out how the sounds of the Arctic were changing. So on all of the research trips that I do like this, the teams that I'm in, we live in very remote places and we don't see any other people for months on end. And it's a real immense privilege to be able to spend time in the world's most beautiful and remote wild places like that. But as well as being a beautiful privilege, we also increasingly find ourselves making headlines that none of us dreamed of making. So on that Arctic trip, for instance, we ended up getting further into the Arctic Ocean than any other sailing boat has in history. And that's not by virtue of the fact that any of us are particularly good at sailing, but just because of how little ice there was. You can see on the videos there, taken from the front and the back of the boat, that the ice is melting to such an extent that you can just drive a sailing boat all the way through it now. And then as we worked in Australia, we found ourselves doing research that was documenting the most severe period of destruction ever recorded on a coral reef. These experiences aren't unique to being a marine biologist, of course. When I talk to and visit my colleagues working in terrestrial environments, they find the same. And together we find that as environmental biologists, we're recording more damage to planet Earth than it's faced since the time of the dinosaurs. So Linda has asked me to come and share what it's like to be a Christian in that setting. That mix of wonder at the natural world and how we sort of share a bit of that. And I'm also really excited to learn from all of you. Firstly, because I'm not particularly theologically trained or qualified, but also because I think that ideas about faith and the environment and what that all means are ideas that everybody should explore, whatever their position in life. Because I think that all of us are in some way connected to or connected by the planet's ecosystems. And the Bible is completely peppered with references to the natural world. So I'm really excited to think more about the natural world and God together with all of you today. And I'd love to hear some of your insights as well as part of that. So this morning, we're going to break it into 2 parts. We're going to have a little tea break in the middle to give ourselves all a minute off the screen time. And before tea, we're going to talk about worship in a world of wonder. And after the break, we'll talk about what it looks like to have faith in a world of wounds. And I'm hoping that by the end of all of that, we'll go away in about an hour and a quarter with an increased appreciation of God and of the natural world and of each other. So that's the broad plan for this morning. And if that all sounds okay, then I guess we'll get started. And I would love to get started by asking you a question. By asking you all, what do you value about the natural world? What's the natural world ever done for you? Why do you value nature? What do you like about it? What does it give you personally? And I wonder if a few people might be brave and might be able to give us just 20 seconds, 30 seconds on what they value about nature, what's special to nature for you.
I'll kick off perhaps then while people are thinking. I had the absolute joy and pleasure of visiting the Iguatu Falls about 5-6 years ago, and just the overwhelming immensity of it, the power of it, and that's at the hands of our Creator. That was, it caused me to, I had to sit down and recover from the awesomeness of the beauty of it.
Thanks very much, Susan. That was wonderful.
I noticed that Rose says that that it's a calming and peaceful impact on going outside. And Joy says it has the God-given ability to regenerate when we leave it alone. And Jeremy says glorious variety and our complete dependence.
Thank you very much, all. That's really wonderful. Great to hear, and some of those are ideas that we're going to pick up on a little bit more as we go on through the morning. So Jeremy there talked about complete dependence, and that's the idea I'd like to start exploring, the idea that nature provides for us. So we're starting by looking at a scientific perspective on this. So there are a group of people called environmental economists, and they're a group of researchers that spend their time trying to work out exactly how much the Earth's environments are worth in monetary value. It's a sort of interesting thought exercise that people may or may not agree with. I can see Ian holding his head in his hands already. Bear with us, Ian, because we're going to look at this as one section of this whole argument. And I think it's a section that we can learn some things for. So environmental economists find through their calculations, whether you like them or not, that the whole of creation is extremely economically valuable. It's worth 125 trillion US dollars by their last estimate, which at the time of the estimate was twice the world's entire GDP. And what they're trying to reflect there is how dependent we are on nature. And there's a few examples of the sorts of things they're calculating. So first up, they talk about food. So everything we eat, everything on our plates, every meal of the day comes from nature. We either grow it or we farm it or we catch it. And in the UK, of course, we're pretty distant from that process, but over a quarter of the world's population grow their own food on farms that are smaller than 2 football pitches. And they're entirely reliant on nature to do that. So this is one of those farmers. This is a lady called Abby Cambuela, who lives in Malawi. That's me on the right. I grew up in Malawi. And Abby was my childminder when my parents went to work. Last year I went to Malawi to visit my parents, and I went and chatted to Abby. I went and visited her in the village she lives in. Abby still feeds herself and her whole family off her 2 fields of maize, as she has done for her whole life. And when I asked Abby what she does in the years where there isn't enough rain for her maize, she smiled at me and she said, "Okay." So a really humbling reminder of God's provision through nature. Of course, as well as eating, we all have to drink, and modern day science describes the natural world's provision of water in the water cycle. So it's this constant dynamic equilibrium that all of the world's water is in, moving around. It's the fundamental backbone that what all of life on Earth relies on. Of course, it's not just water in these cycles. There's other really important cycles of nutrients that sustain the Earth and sustain us. So the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, all of these are delicately balanced part of creation that are essential for sustaining life on Earth as we know it. Energy is another massive one. Our whole global economy is based on energy. It's how we do everything that we do, and nature provides a huge amount of that for us. So it's fossilized animals and plants from millions of years ago that have created the coal and the oil and the gas that have powered our economies for more than a century. But now there's big potential for better, more forward-thinking, renewable technologies that also come from nature. So energy from the wind, the waves, rivers, tides, the sun, plants. On the left here, this is a picture of people growing algae to create biofuel that might well become one of an efficient means of generating power for us in the future. And as well as controlling the biophysical, the natural world controls the biogeochemical cycles that make our planet what it is. So this is the global ocean conveyor belt, which is a worldwide network of thermohaline currents that are constantly transferring heat energy and nutrients all around the world. You've probably heard of a lot of the subcurrents within this global system. You might have heard of the Gulf Stream or the North Atlantic Drift, the Benguela and the Agulhas maybe, the Ayashio in Japan. And all of these currents together dictate weather patterns and seasons and ocean productivity. So the North Atlantic Drift here brings warm water up from the Caribbean, and it keeps the UK at this nice moderate climate that we know, despite the fact that we're at the same latitude as northern Canada. So last time the North Atlantic Drift stopped, we were locked in ice for 1,000 years. And then down in the southern hemisphere, the El Nino Southern Oscillation brings nutrients up the west coast of South America. That supports one of the most productive fisheries on the planet, feeds millions of people. The Agulhas current, that comes down the east coast of Africa. It goes through a reflection here, and then it sends vortices of water spinning up through the Benguelas currents. They're called Agulhas rings, and those vortices drive northwards through the Atlantic, and they govern weather patterns in North America. So you get the picture that the world is reliant on these big systems that drive the weather. They're an inherent part of the functioning of the planet. They control the seasons. They keep us alive. And of course, more relevantly now than ever, nature provides some of the biggest carbon sinks on the planet. Animals and plants in the oceans are a particularly big part of this. So the accumulation of carbon dioxide by photosynthesizing algae and plants, and also the accretion of calcium carbonate by calcifying animals like krill and corals. They have big implications on climate patterns and on the mitigation of global warming. And as well as all of this scientific description of the way that nature provides us, that's quite a scientific lens, the Bible speaks about this as well. It speaks about it in different language, because the authors of the Bible didn't know as much about the mechanisms of how nature was put together. But the sentiment is exactly the same. As early as Genesis, all of the fish in the sea into your hand they're delivered, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. In the Psalms, you cause the grass to grow for the cattle, plants for people to use, to bring forth food from the earth, wine to gladden the heart, oil to make the face shine, bread to strengthen the human heart. And then in Matthew in the Gospels as well, Jesus tells us, don't worry. Don't say, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear? It's the Gentiles who strive for all of these things, and indeed your heavenly Father knows that you need all of these things. The point of this is both science and the Bible actually agree unanimously on this point, that the natural world is immensely valuable. The God who has created us and who loves us has given us a world that looks after us. And yet, as Ian so eloquently put without any words even, by shaking his head at the prospect that we could add everything up to be a sum that had a finite value, we know that there's so much more than this, don't we? We know that we don't love nature only because it keeps us alive. There's more than that. There's something deeper than that. And it's something that people already picked up on when I asked you why you love nature, why you value it. Something we picked up on in the prayer at the start. And it's something that is picked up on beautifully in this video here that I'm going to share now.
I see trees of green, red roses too. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Natural world inspires us, doesn't it? It's staggeringly, mind-blowingly, heart-capturingly beautiful. It inspires thoughts and feelings and emotions and prayers that nothing else can, in a whole range of different ways. So it inspires us because it's beautiful. For me, I feel this sense of awe and beauty when I walk along the beach, when I walk by the sea. For you in Harrogate, maybe it's in the Dales on a clear afternoon, birdsong in the air and a big sky above you. It's somewhere we've all experienced that deep sense of relaxation and contentment when you're at peace in nature. On the right here is a picture of bioluminescence. This is something that particularly fascinates me. We see this when we work in the ocean sometimes, and Charles Darwin wrote about it quite a long time ago. It happens when, on dark nights, tiny dinoflagellates, tiny little animals in the water, undergo a chemical reaction that causes them to emit neon light. And when the water's agitated, the whole sea starts to shimmer blue because of it. Darwin wrote it about his diary here. So he wrote, one very dark night, the sea presented a wonderful and most beautiful spectacle. There was a fresh breeze, and every part of the surface, which during the day is seen as foam, now glowed with a pale light. The vessel drove before her bows 2 billows of liquid phosphorus, and in her wake she was followed by a milky train. As far as the eye reached, the crest of every wave was bright, and the sea above the horizon, from the reflected glare of these livid flames, was not so utterly obscure as over the rest of the heavens. Beautiful description of it. We get bioluminescent seas where we work in Australia sometimes, and as you swim around in the water at night, every time you move a limb or every time you move a piece of equipment, it sparkles and sparks fly off you. It's magical. It's an astonishing experience. At the same time as that beauty, though, nature can fill us with terror, can't it? It can be a really scary place. It can make you feel really, really small, whether that's being caught out in a storm, in a boat that's too small with waves that are too big, whether it's getting lost in the hills as it's falling dark and you don't have an anorak and the weather's closing in and the darkness is closing in and you don't know where you are. You suddenly feel very weak and fragile and helpless and scared. Nature can make us feel vulnerable, make us feel really small. Nature can also fill us with curiosity, can't it? Looking at the intricacies and the wonder and the delicateness of some parts of creation, I think reveals the creativity of God. Nature can be fun, whether your thing is hiking or biking or bird watching or falling off surfboards. Being outside fills us with joy. And then there are moments where nature can just fill us with awe as well. You can be sharing space with fish the size of a school bus, or dolphins that can swim as fast as speedboats, or turtles that can hold their breath for 6 hours. It takes your breath away. More than just trying to keep up with the turtle who's holding his breath, And in all of these characteristics, I think, in all of this beauty and terror and curiosity and awe, there's this hard to describe quality in nature that lifts our hearts upwards, takes us out of the day-to-day mundane, and it connects us to a creator. And unsurprisingly, that is picked up in scripture as well. So we read in the Psalms, the heavens tell the glory of God. We read in it's all over the Psalms, isn't it? Some went down to the sea in ships. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. And of course, Job 38, that famous passage that talks wonderfully about the awesome nature of the creation around us. I think this quality of nature that lifts our hearts upwards is really important. In the 1600s, Francis Bacon talked about the Bible being a book of words and creation being a book of works, which both point us to God. And lots of other people have picked up on that theme since. So John Muir, he was the man who set up America's first national parks. He once described the Sierra Nevada mountains as opening 1,000 windows onto God. And then in a letter to his friend, he once said, "I must return to those mountains. I'm bewitched, enchanted. Tomorrow I must start for the great temple to listen to the winter songs and sermons that are preached and sung only there." It's that idea that nature can teach us things about God that we can't even put into words. Sylvia Earle, as far as I'm aware, she's not even a Christian, but her writing and the things she says reflect some of that as well. Far more simply, she just says, when I slip into the ocean, it's like going home. By reflecting the glory of its creator, I think the creation inspires us to lift our eyes upwards, and it connects us to God. And I think there's a huge value in that. But why is it like this? Why do we feel such a sort of strong emotional link to God when we experience the natural world? I think the reason for that is another reason why creation has huge value. And I think it's because the natural environment is an integral part of God's plan. You see, often we restrict nature to Genesis and the Psalms when we think about it in the Bible, don't we? But actually, it's fully integrated into the entire Bible narrative. It's inexplicably linked to us as a key part of God's whole plan for his whole creation. So to illustrate this, we're going to do a whistle-stop tour of the whole Bible now. Susan and Ian are going to read a whole bunch of examples of passages from Genesis all the way through to Revelation, each of them illustrating the place of the physical environment in a different section of the Bible's salvation story. And you can follow on the screen if you'd like to. You can also choose to close your eyes through this. I think that might be quite powerful if you just close your eyes and listen to the reading. So I'll announce them one by one, and Susan and Ian will read them out. And you can see how I think nature is threaded through this entire story. So we start, of course, with creation, and we start in Genesis 1.
God saw all that he had made, and it was very good.
And that sentiment also appears in John 1.
Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made.
Paul writes about it as well in Colossians 1.
In him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together.
So God made the world. He also formed a covenant, not just with people, but with the whole world. So this is from Genesis 9.
Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on the earth."
So God forms covenant not just with people, but with all life on the earth. God also provides for all life on the earth. So in Job 12, we read this.
In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind.
And in Isaiah 43.
The wild animals honor me, the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland.
And in the Gospels as well, in Matthew 10.
Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care.
So God provides for all of creation, and in turn, all of creation praises God. So this is from Nehemiah chapter 9.
You give life to everything, and the multitudes of heaven worship you.
And this from Psalm 96.
Let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad, let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice before the Lord.
And in that praise, creation bears witness to the Creator. So this from Psalm 19.
The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands.
And Romans 1.
For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made.
Of course, there's suffering in the world as well, and suffering isn't limited to humanity either. So Genesis 3.
Cursed is the ground because of you.
And Isaiah 24.
The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish with the earth.
And in Jeremiah as well, Jeremiah 2.
Defiled my land and made my inheritance detestable.
And in Romans chapter 8.
For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it.
But then that Romans passage carries on from talking about suffering to talking about salvation.
The creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God.
And that idea of salvation for nature is picked up in Isaiah as well.
Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sands will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow.
And in Paul's writing too, Ephesians chapter 1.
With all wisdom and understanding, he made known to us the mystery of his will according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Christ, to be put into effect when the times reach their fulfillment, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ.
And salvation ultimately leads to redemption, which is first foreseen in Isaiah.
I will create new heavens and a new earth.
And then talks about also in 2 Peter.
In keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, where righteousness dwells.
And it comes to fruition in the Revelation.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth.
Thanks very much, Ian and Susan. So you can see all the way through Eden, the faithful worship, from Genesis right through the prophets, the Psalms, Paul's teaching and the Revelation. Nature is a key part of the whole story. It's our creation, it's our worship, it's our rescue, it's our future. It's all inseparably linked to the same events going on in the physical environment. I think this is really important. I think this is something that's really key, that the natural world isn't just somewhere we happen to be living for now, but it's completely central to God's whole plan throughout eternity, from the beginning to the end. Incidentally, in that last reading there about the new earth, in the original Greek, it's exactly the same word used for heaven and new earth as Paul uses in his letters to talk about our new souls and our new bodies in redemption. It's kainos, the word that means, it's a word that means renewed, and it's the same word used for us as it is for the physical environment. I think when we get to the end of this story, when we get to the redemption at the end of time, whatever you imagine that to be like, I don't think we're going to be beamed up off Earth to some far off heaven in the clouds where we forget about this world and everything that ever happened on it. I think we're going to find that this world, that the whole cosmos is renewed by the resurrection. I think we're going to find that the whole of creation will be made very good again, just like it was back in Genesis. And I think we'll find that the whole of nature will rejoice. So mid-November is probably a bit early for Christmas carols, depending on your viewpoint. Some people really love them. But I'm going to shove one in here anyway, because I think it's a carol that describes this really well. And it's the carol that celebrates Christmas as the moment that God saved the world, that God came in. And it says, "Joy to the world, the Lord has come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and let heaven and nature sing." So in summary, before we go for tea, nature is a wonderful gift from God that I think is valuable for three overarching reasons. It's valuable because through nature, God provides for us, keeps us alive. It's valuable because through nature, God inspires us, connects us to him. And it's valuable because the whole of nature is an integral part of the whole salvation plan. Let's have a bit of a tea break. Let's maybe if we take, what do you reckon, Linda? We'll take 3 minutes, 5 minutes. And I suggest we all just pop ourselves on mute, pop our screens off, go to the loo if you need, grab a mug of tea if you need, and we'll go into the second half in, what shall we say, Linda? We've got 5 minutes?
Let's say 5 minutes. So that would be, according to my watch, that will be 47.
Great. I'll see you then. How are we doing? Can see most people are coming back now. How are we getting on, Linda? Do you reckon we're good to go again?
To unpause, Linda, I think.
Linda, you're muted.
There you are. Unmute. There you are.
Okay, sorry, apologies. Thank you for that. I was just saying, yes, we're very good to go, and we've had some lovely messages in the chat box. So thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure there's a couple of people asking for that resource, Tim. I'm sure it's okay for me to email people the resource that you've used of the scriptural references.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, Linda, if you could keep an eye on the chat, that would be great, because I struggle to keep an eye with the slides and everything as well, but I'm more than happy to share any slides or anything that people would like afterwards. Great. I hope you enjoyed your tea break. Before the break, we were celebrating the world of wonder. We saw how God provides for the world he made, how the environment around us supports us in so many different ways. We saw how God inspires us with those thoughts and feelings and emotions and prayers, that nature connects us to God. And we saw that just as God has a salvation plan for humanity, the physical environment and nature are wrapped up as an integral part of that plan. And there's that green thread that runs right the way through the biblical narrative. Now we're going to apply this to our lives. So specifically, we're going to address the fact that today, this natural world that provides for us, that inspires us, that's so central to God's plan, is more damaged than it ever has been before. We're going to dive into the Gospels, and we're going to look at Jesus's life as an example for how, as Christians, I think we should be dealing with environmental destruction. That's not going to be that straightforward, because Jesus was God who came down to earth to live and breathe and walk with people, but the earth that he came down to was quite different to the earth that we live in today. Instead of 8 billion people, there are about 200 million. So that's about the population of Pakistan spread across the whole world. So there was no overpopulation, there was no climate change, there was no ocean acidification, there weren't species extinctions on the same scale, there wasn't a biodiversity collapse. None of that was the world that Jesus lived in. That's all very recent history. In fact, we're the first generation to ever be faced with a world that looks like this. And so as a church, I think we have a unique challenge to work out what our response looks like. And we have to base it on the example that Jesus set in a different way. So that's what we're about today. We're going to be looking at a key turning point in Jesus's life and applying it to a key issue for our society today. So before we turn to Jesus' example, I'm just going to spend a few minutes setting our global context. So I'll warn you now, like they warn you in the doctors, this is going to hurt you in the doctors. We're doing it because it's necessary, okay? Because actually, if we as a church are serious about sharing the love of God with the world, then we need to know properly what state the world is in. So here's a really brief summary that is unashamedly without a sugarcoating. I'm going to start with somewhere that means a lot to me. This is the Great Barrier Reef. It was until recently one of the most dynamic, vibrant, alive, bustling, busy places on Earth. People called it the underwater city of the sea. There was life and color and sound and movement everywhere you looked. And it was a place that I grew up dreaming about. You know, I had posters on my bedroom wall. I could quote you the Attenborough documentaries word for word. I did my first school project on coral reefs at the age of 8. And then as a university student, learning about coral reefs in lecture halls in the UK, I watched in horror as on the news a catastrophe unfolded. Climate change bared its teeth, and the strongest cyclones and the most severe marine heat waves ever recorded tore into the barrier reef. One particular bad heat wave on the northern part of the reef killed 80% of its corals in 3 weeks. I arrived in Australia off the back of that for the first time in 2016, and these were some of the first pictures that I took. Instead of 8-year-old Tim's dreams of swimming through the most biodiverse ecosystem in the world, I was taking surveys of empty grey rubble fields, and it was all too much. Coral reefs, as we know them, have been around for about 24 million years, and scientists think they've never seen this much damage ever before. Of course, it's not just reefs. In the last 50 years, so that's within the lifetime of a lot of people on this Zoom call, the human population on Earth has more than doubled, and in the same time frame, the average population size of wild animals has more than halved. We're in an ecological crisis. There were early pioneers that saw this happening. So Aldo Leopold was a pioneer of wildlife conservation in the States, and he once said that the penalty of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Back then, he was right, because he said this in 1949, when people like him had seen this coming, but nobody had really listened to him, to be honest. And he was alone in his world of wounds. But now, 70 years on from that, is different. Scientists are no longer alone in the world of wounds. Everybody knows about this. And that is mainly because of the horrific damage that it's causing worldwide. The ecological crisis has now become a humanitarian crisis. So at the start of this year, wildfires ripped through Australia. People were fleeing their towns. They were being evacuated off beaches in a sort of like D-Day-esque rescue by the military, leaving their homes in flames behind them. These people are environmental refugees. And they won't be the last of them either. This is Malé, which is the capital of the Maldives. Look how low it is to the sea level. Globally, there are 150 million people that live within 3 feet of sea level. Of course, global sea levels are predicted to rise by more than 3 feet before the end of this century. So soon we're going to have another 150 million people driven away from their homes. And you remember that we chatted about Abby in Malawi in the first half as an example of God providing through nature. Well, climate change has been wreaking havoc with the stability of Malawi's growing season. And now there are droughts in some years, there's floods in others, there's farming failure, there's famine. 1/3 of children in Malawi are malnourished. A friend of mine who works for an NGO in Malawi gave Malawian teenagers digital cameras and asked them to take pictures and write quotes that they would want people around the world to see. So she asked them the question, what do you want to tell the world? And these are the pictures they took. And they said, I want to tell the world that because of people far away from this village, our weather is changing. I want to tell the world that climate change is destroying our lives. I want to tell the world that your today steals our tomorrow. People are being burned out of their homes, they're being flooded out of their homes, they're being starved out of their homes. This is a humanitarian crisis. And of course, now that all this ecological and humanitarian crisis has gone crashing into the mainstream knowledge, now it's all coming home to roost for us. Unsurprisingly, now that we know about this sort of horrifying technicolor detail that's all over the mainstream media, it's affecting mental health. So we discussed in the first half that the physical environment, when it's going well, lifts our hearts upwards. It connects us to God. Well, the opposite is true. When it's going badly, when we see the natural world that supports us and provides us and inspires us, when we see it falling apart, it makes us feel really distressed. A couple of years ago, scientists formally defined this set of feelings as being called ecological grief or eco-anxiety. But whatever you want to call it, it's this increasingly common phenomenon that people find it very difficult, very distressing. Feelings of uncertainty, feelings of sadness, of anguish, of anger, feeling troubled. I wonder if people on this call feel that. You pop your hand up if you feel anything like that in response to looking at the natural world around us. Feel a sense of hopelessness. Lots of hands going up. This is something I think that we all feel, and I think it's something that's important that we address. Welcome to the world of wounds. It's important that we are here, because ultimately, as a worldwide church, as Christians, we need to engage with this because we proclaim a gospel that says, "Comfort ye my people." A gospel that says, "Come to me, you who are weary, and I will give you rest." A gospel that says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Sometimes it feels pretty dark, doesn't it? So what do we do? What's our answer? When everything's such a painful, twisted mess, we need to have a response as Christians, don't we? So as Christians, we celebrate that in Jesus, God came to earth to live in the mess, to have human relationships, to live with human problems, to face human crises. And although Jesus never faced environmental destruction like this, he did face the sorts of feelings and despair that we get when we look at the environment in other contexts. So we're going to look today at one of Jesus's darkest days. We're going to look at an example of him facing extreme suffering. And we're going to try and apply that to how we can face the suffering that we see in the natural world around us today. So I'm going to invite my mum to read this. My mum's one of the wisest women I know, one of the wisest people I know. And we've thought about this together for years. And we both think that this passage is really important in what it teaches us about how we can respond to the world around us. Mum, if the internet's still holding, I can't see you on the call, but are you still here somewhere?
I'm here, yes.
Great,
Thanks for
well
the
done.
endorsements. Okay, so we're going to read John chapter 11, verses 17 to 44. So that's John's Gospel, chapter 11, verses 17 to 44. And it's the story of Lazarus. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Thanks be to God.
Thank you very much. So let's start with a bit of context, because this is a really important moment in the Gospel of John. So theologians have called this the pivotal miracle, and they've also described it as the resurrection that leads to death. And that's because this is the 7th out of the 7 miracles recorded by John, and it leads directly to Jesus' crucifixion. The resurrection of Lazarus attracts massive local attention. Crowds start flocking to see the guy who just brought Lazarus back from the dead. That causes concern with the local authorities, who immediately start making plots to kill Jesus. And from Bethany here, the next place Jesus goes is Jerusalem. Crowds follow him there, waving palm leaves and shouting Hosanna. That's Palm Sunday. And of course, by the next Friday, Jesus is on the cross. And 3 days later, he's resurrected not just Lazarus, but himself. So the events here basically lead us straight to Easter week. And it's also an occasion that Jesus faces massive emotional turmoil. So Lazarus was Jesus's friend. In fact, Jesus knew the whole family well. Mary and Martha were Lazarus's sisters, so this is the death of a close family friend. And because of Jesus's delayed arrival, people are accusing him of not caring. They're accusing him of allowing Lazarus to die. And just to throw one final bit of spice into the mix, the last time Jesus visited this part of the country, they tried to stone him. So it's quite a day. And actually, a lot of the feelings going on here are remarkably similar to the ones that we discussed earlier. There's sadness, there's anger, there's hopelessness, there's grieving, there's anxiety, there's blame. And as Jesus walks into this emotional cauldron, I think it's really valuable to look at what he feels, at what he says, and at what he does. So let's start with the emotions. Let's look at what Jesus feels in this episode. So we're going to look at the original language of the book. So we're going to look in ancient Greek. And first up, we have Mary and the other Jews with her weeping. This word is kleia. And here's the definition of it. It's to grieve audibly. It's bitter grief that springs from feeling utterly hopeless, usually accompanied by shrieks brought on by uncontainable emotional pain. This isn't a sort of polite weeping, a quiet weeping. This is full-on wailing. Look at the definition. It's anguish. It's the same word used in the passage in Matthew that talks about hell being full of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Same weeping word. Mary's brother has just died and she's in complete anguish. And in response to this, Jesus is deeply moved in spirit. This word is embryomai, which literally translates as to snort like an angry horse. Other dictionaries have it as to roar with rage or to express strongly indignant displeasure. This is really angry. And it's more than just angry. Jesus is he's in turmoil. He's troubled, tarassa. It's the word that is used when Jesus walks on water and the disciples are terrified. They think they've seen a ghost. That's the same troubled word. And it's also the same word used in the next chapter when Jesus predicts his own death. He's troubled by that. It's this inward commotion. But interestingly, this is the only time in the Bible that we see this tarassa word said as eterexen, which is the reflexive form of it. So that means something that you do to yourself. Jesus is choosing to feel this way. He's made himself feel troubled. So Jesus isn't just a passive observer who's being affected by the events around him in a way that he can't help. It's a reflexive verb. He's actively choosing to engage emotionally. The direct literal translation of this sentence is he was deeply moved in spirit and he troubled himself. And then he arrives at the grave and he weeps. But this isn't the anguished wailing of Mary. This is edacruisen, from the verb dakrua, to weep silently, to shed tears. It's sorrow. And so in the midst of all this hot anguish and anger, the inward commotion, there's also a deep sorrow. And there's silent tears rolling down Jesus's cheeks as he walks to the grave of his friend. And finally, when he gets there, he calls out in a loud voice. And if you're like me, you probably imagine this at first as a sort of calm, authoritative presence. A bit like, he's arrived with the ambulance, he's got the defibrillator, and he's just going to, loudly announce, stand back, everybody calm, I've got this. But it's not like that at all, actually, when you look at the Greek. It couldn't be more different from this. Jesus isn't in a place to be calm. He's in turmoil, and this reflects that. It's crazer. It's an urgent scream that expresses deep emotion. It's clamorous shrieking, like a wounded person emitting unearthly sounds in one dictionary. Plato uses this crazer word to describe dogs howling to the moon. It's animalistic. This isn't pretty. Jesus is in desperation here. And when you look at all of these words together, when you look at the emotional depth in this passage, when it comes to difficult emotions, this scenario is white hot. There's anguish, there's rage, there's distress, there's sorrow, there's desperation. Does it sound familiar? It sounds familiar to me. When we look around us, at the world around us, we can feel anguish and rage and distress and sorrow and desperation. And Jesus has been there. He's faced those feelings. He's actively stirred those feelings up in himself. So he doesn't just get it, he embraces it as an appropriate response to the suffering around him. He chooses to feel that way. And I think that's crucial because it gives us a really important route to being able to pray about this stuff honestly. Here's a few quotes from leading conservationists, people working on the forefront of protecting nature, who are Christians. They've seen more environmental damage than most people have. This is a guy called Jeremy Lindsell, worked for the RSPB and for Arusha. He says the overwhelming temptation would be to walk away, but then he goes on to say there is someone to whom I can take these things that cause me anxiety, despair, bereavement. Simon Stewart worked for the IUCN for a long time. He wrote conservation reports for very endangered animals. And he wrote, it's okay for us to be angry about the degradation of creation. It's okay to cry out to God for help, to hold him accountable, to plead with him. And then Bob Sluka, who's the director of Arusha's marine program, wrote, even Jesus wept. Sometimes you need to grieve, even perhaps lament. So these feelings are common to Jesus, they're common to his followers, and they're common to leaders of global conservation programs, and they're common to us. I think there's a lot of comfort in that. It's an experience that is shared by Christians around the world, and it's one that's shared by Jesus himself. So in complete honesty, we can bring this to God in prayer. I think that's really important. So that's what Jesus felt, and there's what Jesus says. And what he says here is massive. It's huge. It's one of the biggest moments in the gospel. It's the I am the resurrection and the life statement. It's the claim that drove the religious authorities of the day completely mad. Everybody knows that only God has power over death, and he just comes out and says it outright here. I am the resurrection. Ultimately, it leads him to be crucified. And I think it's very poignant that this massive statement doesn't come in a time of power or a time of jubilation or a time of celebration. It comes at a time of suffering. Yes, it's a statement of authority, but it's a statement of comfort in the midst of grief. Martha's beside herself, and Jesus is telling her that ultimately God is in control. that there's life after death, that for humanity and for creation, there will be life renewed. That throughout the darkness, there's a future of redemption to hold on to. And that sentiment is also echoed by Christian conservation leaders. So Peter Harris, I couldn't do my job without Christian hope. Despite all of the environmental devastation that I've witnessed, I believe that God loves his world and that he will inspire great things short term and renew everything in the end. And Miranda was a wonderful woman, and she said, we can look all the bad news in the eye, but keep writing our stories in the landscape and say with confidence, it isn't over yet. God still has plans for the world he loves. And then, of course, as well as engaging emotionally in what he feels and engaging verbally in what he says, Jesus acts. And in the ultimate act of putting his money where his mouth is, he brings Lazarus back from the dead. He demonstrates the resurrection. And he doesn't just sort of serenely swan through the human suffering and say, it's all right, you'll all go to heaven one day and you'll forget this mess, so don't worry about it for now. Suffering on earth doesn't really matter because it's only temporary. He doesn't say that. There's a term for that. That's called escapist eschatology. The idea that we can ignore bad things on earth because we're on our way to heaven and it'll be fine. And that's not what Jesus says here. Despite the fact that just a few verses earlier, he's explicitly said that there will be a future ultimate salvation, he still acts decisively in the here and now, in the middle of the suffering, despite knowing that it's only one person's life and the whole world around is still suffering. He still acts. So why does he do that? I think there's two reasons why Jesus acts, why he raises Lazarus. And firstly, I think it's because it's an act of witness. So when he says to Martha in verse 40, he says, if you believe, you will see the glory of God. And then in verse 42, just before he calls Lazarus out of the tomb, he thanks God for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. So by raising Lazarus from the dead, he's pointing towards his own resurrection. He's pointing towards that ultimate redemption. And as well as that act of witness, of course, it's an act of love, because the people that Jesus loves are deeply wounded. We've seen already that he is suffering with them, and he acts because he loves them and because he shares in that pain. And I think that's the example we're called to follow. Today, the natural world and the people who rely on it are suffering more than ever before. Well, Jesus knew suffering, and when he met it, he shared the pain, he witnessed to a future redemption, and he acted defiantly in love. So I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. I'm in no position to do that. And that's partly because the stuff that we can do to show love to people around the world is so varied, and everyone is in different scenarios, and nobody can do everything. But what I am going to say is that everyone can do something. Whatever situation you're in, you can show the world that no matter how bad it gets, you will be a force for love. Because you believe in a God that will restore everything in the end. Sort of echoes the words of Joshua, who said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Kind of echoes the words of the German church who were being oppressed by the Nazis. They said commonly in those scenarios that they used the saying, even if the world was ending tomorrow, I would still plant my apple tree. It's this idea that even if you can't save the world on your own, through your actions, you can show love to the world by thinking really carefully about what you do, and that is an act of witness and an act of love. So there are lots of different ways we can do that. We can show the world that we love by thinking about how we travel, by thinking about the emissions associated with that, by thinking about what we eat. So this graph at the top and the middle shows us that beef and lamb in particular have a carbon footprint that's about 10 times higher than most other food. We can think about how we power our homes and the buildings that we're in. We can think about whether or not we want to protest against the powers that be, the government, and how we want to do that. And we can get involved in our churches. There's lots of different things we can do. If you're struggling for ideas, I can really recommend these two places as a starting point. So if you put in David Attenborough, How to Save Our Planet into YouTube, there's a wonderful 8-minute video there. And if you search for Ruth Valeria's website, she writes a bunch of stuff on there. But ultimately, I don't think knowing what to do is the difficult thing here. I think it's finding the motivation and the conviction to do it. And I think once that's there, I think the rest follows. And I think for me, that conviction and that motivation comes from Jesus and comes from his actions in a way that's demonstrated at the tomb of Lazarus. So he showed us that he cares about suffering, and he showed us that fighting suffering can be an act of worship and an act of witness and an act of love. I think when we live in a way that protects the earth today, we worship the God who made it, and we witness to its future, to its redemptive future, and we share love with the most vulnerable people on the planet. I think when we live in a way that protects the earth, we show that the light shines in the darkness and that the darkness hasn't overcome it. So I'd like you to, I'm going to leave you again with that carol and with the challenge that in the 6 weeks between now and Christmas, as we come into that season, what could you do that would bring joy to the world? What could you do that would celebrate all of God's creation? What could you do that would make heaven and nature sing? And I'm going to leave it there.
Gosh, thank you so much, Tim, for really inspiring us with a real message of truth and of hope. And I wonder if anybody has any particular questions. There's a few things that have come up in the chat box. Leslie Higginson is talking about Grassington and District Peace Group and their lecture last night, which was no climate justice, no peace. And so she's talking there about justice. I don't know if she actually wants to say anything about that. Rose is talking about the work of Arosha and their initiative to help churches become eco-churches. And she also says that she's happy to chat to anyone about the process. And I think that's also something I know that Share Road Church, I know Simon and Ruth Grenfell are here, that's something they've been involved with as well. Do we have any particular questions that anybody would like to put to Tim in the chat box? We have a few minutes. We have 10 minutes before our scheduled end. You say you're not a theologian, Tim. If you're not a theologian, I don't think I am at all. Is anybody, can we see, has anybody got anything that they want to, let me just have a look on gallery view. Anybody put their hand up who wants to say anything? Jeff, you want to say something? Unmute. Unmute, Jeff. You're still muted, Jeff. Okay.
There, how's that?
Good.
It's a terribly depressing quote, but it emphasizes the size of the problem. And it's by the guy whose name I can't remember. He runs the site Sustainable Energy Without Hot Air. And he said, unfortunately, he said, if we all did just a little, it would only make a little difference. Or in other words, it needs some massive structural changes beyond what any individual can do. And I'm wondering if Tim has any thoughts on what those might be.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And also thank you to all of the people who have been writing things in the chat as we've gone. I've just caught up with those and seen those. There's some brilliant things in the chat, so do check those out if you've not read that. Jeff, I think you're absolutely right. I think this is a massive problem that needs a massive solution. And it's certainly true that by doing little things here and there, the solution isn't going to go away. But I think personally, from an emotional point of view for all of us, I think little things change the way we think, they change the way we believe, and they change the way that we look at the problem from a personal perspective. So I've heard analogies that compare doing the little things like going to see somebody who's really, really sick and not being able to do anything except just give them a hug. You know, and you don't give them a hug because you think it's going to cure them, or you think it's going to make the problem any better. But you give them a hug because it's an act of love, and because it shows that you care, and because it shows that you're willing to engage in that scenario and to just do something, even if you don't know what the big picture solution is. And I guess I'm not a politician, and I'm not somebody who can change the world's big energy structures, but I do know that this is something that I personally have found difficult. Apologies for the emotional falling apart at points there. This is stuff that means a lot. And I know that when I act in ways that are very small and ways that possibly don't make a difference on a global scale, they make a massive difference in my relationship with God and in my relationship with the people around me and in the way that I can address this issue personally. And I think that we have to be thinking about that as well as thinking about the sort of means to an end. How are we getting out of this as a global society?
Thank you for that. No, I found that very helpful actually, and yeah, quite a reproach. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question? I'm just going to scan through. I can see Tim there. I'm just checking on my other screen, and I can also see Jemima. So if we start with Tim and then we go to Jemima.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed, Tim, for that. It was such a wonderful overview. But I was particularly struck by the fact that you ended up with the issue of motivation and spiritual understanding, because it's so easy in this field, isn't it, to sort of throw at people a load of things they ought to do or not do, whereas actually motivation is at the heart of it, whether we're talking in a Christian context or a spiritual context generally, or in a political context. It's actually it's changing from the inside out, rather than putting a whole lot you brought across this morning that is often, I think, forgotten about, because in communicating with people there has to be a heart change. I've often said, that the evangelism and environmental care are not at opposite ends of the spectrum. They're very close, because the situation is really tricky, really difficult, and it needs a change of heart as well as change of particular habits. So thanks very much indeed for explaining it in that way. I don't have any other comments to make about that, but it was encouraging to hear the perspective that you gave.
Can I cheat and just butt in and say I was so inspired by your exposition of John 11 and the story of Lazarus. I am deeply moved, and I've learned something. I've been enlightened. Thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful of you to say. Thank you very much. Really kind of you. And Tim, I think you're absolutely right that I think ultimately this is a challenge of motivation rather than a challenge of logistics or technical ability. And I don't think there is any doubt that if the whole world really, really wanted to solve this, that we would. And so from that perspective, I think for me anyway, the first challenge is persuading people that we really, really want to do this. And I don't see that there's a way to do that without addressing people's hearts.
Thank you. Jemima, you wanted to say something.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Tim, for an absolutely fabulous talk. Some of you will know me. I work as the Environment Officer for the Church of England Diocese of Leeds. So my life is kind of embedded in this day to day, and you know, I have been on that kind of roller coaster of emotions myself, and cope day to day with the eco grief that you've been describing. And yeah, but you know, my hope is in that renewal for the whole of creation through Jesus, as you described, which is actually just really exciting, and for me makes the gospel so much bigger than just thinking about people, and so much, you know, brings so much hope for us as we share what Jesus has done. So thank you for explaining that, you know, so well this morning from your own experiences. And in terms of hope, I mean, I find that putting my energy and directing some of that grief and anger into constructive things, and locally, personally, I do that through working through Zero Carbon Harrogate, which is a local campaign group, which others may know of. But there are plenty of different organisations, a Russia and Eco Church, has already been mentioned, fantastic. But there are so many groups where we can actually begin to make that structural change as well as the personal change. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jemima. And I think it's the personal change that leads to the structural change in some ways, isn't it? Because you know, I think you only have to look at trends in politics and in the way that businesses market themselves as well over the last 10 years to realize that. 10 years ago, I think having environmental concerns labeled you as a bit of a weirdo, to be honest. You're a bit of a tree hugger. It was a minority issue. It wasn't really addressed by advertising campaigns or by political slogans or whatever. And now it's center stage. It's all over the place. These businesses and political parties are competing with each other to appear green. And that comes from a groundswell of demand, because these economies and political powers are responding to what they perceive to be the important things in society today, and what people are going to respond positively. So by each making little changes, actually, there's a sense in which we can drive structural change at a higher level as well, just by sort of market demand, for want of a better word.
Thank you. I think we might have time just for one last question, if there is one out there. I'm going to quickly look across the screens. Anybody raise their hand who has got something burning they want to? I don't. Have I got a? No, I can see one or two hands. I'm not sure if what people are reaching for. I think it's probably, we're just about at 11:30. If anybody wants to stay on for a moment and ask something in a smaller forum, Tim, would that be okay with you?
Yeah.
Yeah, just for a short time, that would be brilliant. But I cannot thank you enough, Tim. I met you when you came to St Hill College Easter School, and you were the WOW speaker of Easter School 18 months ago. I mean, you've really inspired some long-term changes in our organisation. And I think it's that thing, isn't it, that sometimes hope is in the small. You know, that you do what you can do. But it's been such a treat to have you this morning, and I just would love to thank you and just to say it's been brilliant. And for our first online lecture, thank you so much. So thank you. And I'm just seeing a few comments come up it's always the way, isn't it, right at the end. Leslie is asking if where the lecture will be recorded. So that she wants to listen again. So Tim Cundy, can you just comment on that, please?
Yes, hopefully it will go onto the website if everything works correctly, but I don't know quite when it will get there, but I'll send an email round to everybody to say that it's there. Okay, thanks.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you very much, Linda, for
it's just been
inviting
fantastic.
me along and for welcoming me. It's been wonderfully inspiring for me as well to be part of this morning and to hear all of the wonderful input from people around this call. It inspires me too. And it's something that's been a real privilege and a pleasure to be part of your community here online. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, thank you. I think we can all do a kind of online. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, thank you again for your participation. We'll be back again with Malcolm Guite on the 5th of December, Saturday the 5th of December. That is right, isn't it? Not at me, Tim. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm not always great on numbers. So have a lovely day. Have a blessed day, and I hope to see you again soon.